Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Jstfish Outdoors TV. This week we're going to be talking about wintertime bass fishing as we move on in out of the fall and progress on into the wintertime with the falling water temperatures as well as the other conditions that make it somewhat a little bit tougher on us that are wintertime bass fishermen. I'm going to talk a little bit about tips that I use, lures that I personally select and use, and when I use them, and also some of the tactics I use when I'm looking for those wintertime bass and trying to get those somewhat uncooperative fish to eat as well, which can sometimes be the biggest puzzle of all, is trying to get those fish to eat because as those water temperatures fall, their activity just goes in the basement sometimes, and it's very, very difficult to get them fish to eat on a regular basis. So what we'll go through and do is we'll talk about wintertime bass fishing tips, as I said ahead, and like we'll talk about some lures and tactics. With the winter months approaching and water temps dropping down into the 50s and below, a bass's metabolism slows down with the dropping water temps, and they become very, very sluggish. It is almost impossible sometimes to get these fish to eat, depending on weather conditions and water activity, and their activity overall is just significantly reduced. Also, during the upcoming winter season, us fishermen, we're going to need to change up our tactics quite a bit, and also change up our presentations. We're going to need to throw some things that we really haven't thrown all year. And we're going to need to fish, the most common thing is slow. And if you think you're fishing slow enough, you need to slow down just a little bit more, because sometimes that just the mere speed or the movement of that lure, or the lack of movement in that lure, can many, many times mean the difference between you catching fish and going home skunked. We're going to need to change up our presentations. We're going to need to change some selections. And like I said, folks, remember, regardless of what you're selecting to fish with, you're really, really going to need to slow it down, and slow it down even more. One of the most important pieces of the pattern puzzle is retrieve speed and lure movement. Like I'm talking about, in cold water temps, this can really mean the difference. It doesn't take sometimes but just letting that bait sit there an extra 5 or 10 or 15 seconds, as opposed to moving it, to trigger that strike. So we really need to get into a situation where we're locked into them. We're slowly moving that bait in many instances, and in some cases we're dead sticking that bait. We're not moving that bait at all. My experience has shown me that the bass will not normally chase a lure in water temperatures much lower than 50 degrees. When you get out of those lower 50s, mid 50s, the only possible exception to that could be maybe when the bass move up shallower after we have a good warm spell, or you have some good warming days and you have 2 or 3 consistent warming days. That can sometimes trigger them into feeding, especially if that's right ahead of another approaching cold front, where those water temperatures are going to drop even lower. So sometimes that can be the key. In cold water months, the bass movements can vary widely. They can move from very deep water to shallow water, and vice versa, depending on the weather and water conditions. For instance, one of the things to look at is if you're fishing a reservoir or lake that's heavily stained, where we got some muddy water or very, very heavily stained water, the condition will often locate those fish much higher or shallower in the water column then opposed to fishing something, a reservoir or lake that is much clearer or you know, very, very lightly stained. Certain things can really have an impact, like a recent cold front can also move those fish from a shallower to a deeper level in the water column. You know, things like weather patterns become much, much more important in some cases than they are in the springtime. Weather patterns along with water conditions are crucial to helping you put a pattern together when those water temperatures really get down. You know, that's one of the things to really remember. You know, it's not only the weather conditions, but it's also it's very much the water conditions. So, you know, pay attention to those combinations. You know, you may have to fish a little differently 2 or 3 days after a cold front in muddy conditions as opposed to 2 or 3 days after a cold front in clear water conditions. Many of these fish's movement this time of year is as much vertical as it is horizontal. You know, you'll catch a lot of fish that may be in a feeding mood very close to deep water, along an edge, along a creek bank, along a creek edge, along a point, along a drop off. And what happens is those fish may move up on that flat or up on top of that creek when they're feeding. And when we get these bluebird or cold fronts that come in, many times what they'll do is they'll just go down vertically in the water column. They'll just back off just a slight amount off of that creek channel bend or that point, and they'll vertically just drop down to a deeper level. That's why it's so important to pay attention very closely to the weather conditions, and you know, how stable or how unstable they are, depending on when you can go fishing. You know, we always don't have the opportunity to go fishing when the weather condition is perfect. Sometimes we have to go fishing when we can go fishing, and you know, trying to put that puzzle together as far as the water conditions and the weather conditions can really make a huge impact on helping you put a pattern together that'll work for you. Now let's talk a little bit about lure selection. One of the first baits that comes to mind, and I do fish it quite a bit, is a finesse worm or creature bait. You know, throwing a 3 or 4 ounce bait, 4-inch long bait during these conditions can really trigger strikes that sometimes throwing a bigger or a faster moving bait will not trigger. So you know, this is one of the lures that is really beneficial, and you need to have a rod rigged. You know, I'm usually throwing 6.6, 7.6 spinning rod. I'm throwing 6 8-pound test line. I've got a 3 or 4 inch size bait rigged with a 1/4 to 1/2 ounce jig, and that's based on really the water depths that I think I'm going to be fishing, or even the wind conditions. When it's a little windier, I'll throw a little heavier bait. When the weather conditions and the wind conditions are much lighter, I'll go down to a 1/4, and in some cases even go down to an 1/8 ounce jig head. The one commonality of these creature baits and these smaller finesse worms and baits is they're deadly on all species of bass. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're smallmouth fishing, whether you're largemouth fishing, or whether you're throwing at Kentucky's. You know, many cases you can get into a situation where you can catch all 3 species in the same area and on the same bait. So you know, it can be a very deadly bait. This bait tends to produce better when you've got low wind conditions, or when you've got a high bluebird day, when those fish are really locked down. Sometimes this is the only way to get bit on those days. So you know, have your rod rigged. You know, 6.6, 7.6 spinning rod, 6 8-pound line, and have you one of these creature baits, 3 or 4 inch creature baits in whatever color that you like. You know, I like the darker colors and the darker water, and the more translucent colors in the clearer water. So everyone's got their own favorite colors, and there's a myriad of them out there. So pay attention to these as well. Even something like the Jean LaRue Sweet Swimmer or can be very deadly as well. It's a minnow type bait, and sometimes it bounced up and down off the bottom can trigger strikes as well. So don't pass up a selection of these plastics rigged on these type of weed half or quarter ounce weed jig heads, because they can really be crucial to you catching a few fish throughout the day. When I'm throwing these baits, I like to target steep rock banks with a high degree of angle. Bass are drawn to these areas because they can make extreme depth changes by moving vertically in the water column. We talked about that earlier, how bass really relate to that sense of security of deep water close by this time of year especially, and they really have a tendency to migrate more vertically in the water column than they do horizontally in the water column. So it can really make a difference sometimes if you're fishing that particular type of pattern, because the bass really become very comfortable when they've got when they got deep water really close by, and that way, like I said, they can move vertically in a water column. They can also feed that direction or feed that way because they sense that, and they don't use much energy when they're feeding like that. They're moving vertically up and down in a water column depending on water conditions and weather conditions, and so they're not expending much energy when they're feeding in that particular area. One of the things that you want to do with this bait, how I like to fish it, cast it out there, let it fall to the bottom, let it sit there for maybe as high as 10 or 15 seconds before you ever move the bait. And then when you do move the bait, one of the key factors is moving that rod tip very little. Maybe a couple of inches is all it's going to take to move that bait in the water. Don't overpower that bait by trying to move it 4, 5, 6, 8 inches at a time, because that can really be detrimental to that bait. A lot of times those fish will sit there and look at it, and they're just not going to chase it when you move that bait 4, 5, 6 inches. They'll just let it go because they don't want to expend that energy to chase that bait. When you're fishing these baits, 99 times out of 100, most of the bites or strikes are going to come when that lure is falling. You will get occasionally a strike when you pull the bait up or start to reel it in, but most of your strikes are going to come when that bait is falling down toward the bottom almost every time. So also become a line watcher, because this time of year many of the strikes that you're going to get are very faint, and many times what you're going to see is that line twitch, jump, or do something it's not supposed to do when you're fishing with it. In many cases you'll never feel that bite on the rod tip, but you'll see that line jump or hesitate when it's supposed to be falling. That's very common. When you hop these baits up and they start falling, they stop, and you know that something's up because it's deeper than that where you're at. So pay attention, really pay attention. I've caught a lot of very big bass that if you weren't paying attention to that bait, especially this time of year, you would have never known that fish hit that bait. So really pay attention and become a line watcher, and take advantage of that, because you can produce fish that you otherwise wouldn't even know hit. One of the next bait we'll go to and talk about a little bit, of course, is a spinner bait. A large bladed spinner bait can produce strikes when other baits fail to do so this time of year. A half-ounce spinner bait coupled with a large blade, when it's fished very slowly, can be deadly for these deeper fish. I use this bait, you know, very often, but I usually use a pretty large blade on it, or a series of blades that produce, depending on whether I'm fishing darker water again or I'm fishing clearer water. I like a little more shine when I'm fishing the clearer water, and I like a little more thump or a little more vibration when I'm fishing cloudy or stained water. Well, you know, once again, it can be very, very deadly. I have a tendency to use this bait on more stable weather conditions, like when we've had you know, a couple of 3 days of pretty consistent weather, and those fish, every day we get that sunshine and a little better weather, they get just a hair more active, and this bait can really produce on those certain times. I usually don't fish this bait very much, or haven't been very productive with it, when I'm fishing right behind a cold front condition. That seems to really have an impact. And the next bait we'll talk about is really probably my go-to bait this time of year. When I'm fishing, anytime I'm fishing water temps below 60 degrees, I have a jig tied on to at least 1 or 2 of my rods, and it may be, you know, 1 or 2 different colored jigs, but you know, this is the one bait, folks, that if you haven't fished a jig and chunk much, you really need to buckle down and learn how to fish this bait. It is an extremely good fish producing bait this time of year, and it's also an extremely good big fish producer. You know, I've caught almost all of my 10+ pound fish on a jig and chunk, but I also have that much confidence in it, and I fish it a lot this time of year. It just is an excellent producer. And then when I travel around and do my seminars on nighttime big bass strategies, you know, this jig and chunk, you know, gets the light shined on it more than any other bait I throw. You know, you can catch big fish on a big worm, you know, a 10-12 inch worm thrown in these colder water conditions. But I just have much more luck and much more confidence in throwing this jig and chunk, and it like I said, it's my go-to bait when I'm fishing these colder water temps. The bait over the years has, just like I said, produced very consistently. One of the things I look at is, you know, depending on water depth, I use the 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce jig, and regardless of what weight of jig I'm using, I'm trailering it with a 6-inch Jean LaRue hog crawl. You know, that produces a very big profile bait in the water. It looks like a giant crawfish in the water, and you know, that's one of the things that the fish really are inherently able to do, is they're able to calculate how much energy they're going to receive feeding on a bait, as exposed to how much energy they're going to have to produce to catch that bait. And they are very economical, especially this time of year when that water temperature gets below 50s, mid 50s, below 50s. So they like to eat less often, but when they do eat, they like to eat a bigger bait in many instances, especially if you're hog hunting. They're just very good at calculating how much energy versus how much they're going to get. You know, the Jean LaRue hog crawl, you know, it's a 6-inch bait, and it is absolutely my year-round jig trailer. I don't trailer my jigs with anything else. They are awesome baits for producing really quality fish. You know, a bass is really lethargic this time of year, and getting them to strike a large bait is really, in some cases, a little easier or a little more tempting than getting them to strike a smaller bait. So sometimes just the size of the bait will produce strikes that smaller baits will not. that's kind of my main baits that I look at when I'm going into that sub 50, low 50 water temp conditions. You know, like I said, you know, the jig's my go-to bait. I'll throw a spinner bait a little bit. I'll also throw a smaller creature bait or grub. Sometimes that's the only thing you can get bit on as well. You just have to have all of these lures. You know, they're tools of the trade, so to speak. You know, it's like having a set of socket wrenches or a set of Allen wrenches or whatever in your toolbox. You need these baits available in your toolbox to be able to use them and explore the success with them based on the weather and the water conditions that you're faced with at the time you're fishing. You know, that can change too in the course of a morning to an evening, afternoon anyway. You know, and it's just really important to have all these tools at your disposal. We'll go into a few other tips. You know, one of the things I've really been talking about and focusing on in tonight's show is the weather. You know, in the winter, it is important to watch the weather patterns. And folks, I can't emphasize that enough. Weather patterns are just as important, and some would argue, if not more important, than bait selection. It can really sometimes mean the difference between you catching quite a few fish and going home with zero. So, you know, try to time your fishing trip. You know, maybe 2 to 3 days after a cold front or major weather change, because this can really help and improve your chances tremendously. You know, if you're lucky enough to hit a warming weather trend, which will coincide with a barometric pressure change, that can really cause the bass to kind of go on a little mini feeding spree. And you know, if you're there in that magic 3 to 4 or 2 to 4 in the afternoon range, when that water temp may be its highest it's going to be in 2 or 3 days, sometimes you can really knock them in the head. You can catch a lot of fish if you hit it just right. And you know, it has some advantages because there's nobody else on the water. But that also can be a disadvantage as well. And one of the major things I'll talk about in this next segment is safety. Folks, you know, you cannot be safety minded enough when you're out there on the water in these colder water fishing conditions. You know, do things like always wear your PFD. Excuse me. You know, if you fall in the water this time of year when that water temperature's in the 40s or even in the 50s, it doesn't take much or very long for hypothermia to start setting in. So you know, always have your PFD on. The other things I'll go through here is you know, always pack a change of clothes in your boat. If you're going to be fishing this time of year, and you know, you stick a leg in the water at the boat ramp or something, you know, you don't even have to fall in the water, even if you get your boots or shoes wet. You know, just having a change of clothes can mean the difference between you staying out there all day or most of the day and being comfortable, and you know, having to slide back to the trailer because you're getting cold and you're uncomfortable. So always pack a change of clothes with you. Another issue or another thing is always have a cell phone with you. You know, that cell phone can sometimes be really helpful, especially if you have some kind of breakdown or something happens where you're not able to get back to the ramp and you just need to call someone to come bail you out. You know, and that kind of coincides with, you know, tell someone about your plans. You know, your wife, your loved one, your spouse, your girlfriend, you know, mom and dad, whoever, best friend, whatever, you know, especially in the wintertime, you know, let them know what your plans are, and let them know approximately what time you're going to be off the water, or when you do come back off the water, you know, take your cell phone and give that person that you told your plans to a call. Let them know that you're safe off the water, and you know, you'll be home shortly. One of the extremely important things I'll pass along is have a boarding ladder installed on your boat. Because if you're out there fishing and whatever happens and you do fall in the water and you're not very close to the bank, or even if you're close to the bank, you know, it's not going to do you a lot of good sometimes to get to the bank, and now you don't have any boat, so you still, just that hypothermia is still going to get you. So you know, have that boarding ladder installed on your boat. And you know, there's some very nice ones nowadays that fold up and are very minimal as far as the space they take up, and they really truly can save your life. So you know, think about that as well. They're pretty economical. They're not that much as far as you know, what they add to the cost of your boat. Another thing I'll throw at you is unclutter or arrange your fishing deck. You know, make it safer to where you don't have 75 rods stacked out on your deck and you can't even walk around for fear of tripping or breaking some rods. So you know, get that one rod out at a time and fish with that rod. And when you're done, put that rod back in the rod box and pull your next rod out. It can mean just a real safe area as well, and maybe keep you out of trouble in the process. Another thing I'll throw at you real quick is have a blanket and some water with you, you know, in case you do run into a situation to where the weather may be changing, your boat breaks down, your motor won't start, and you're, you know, 5 miles from the boat ramp, and it's going to be quite a spell before someone can come and get you, even though you have your cell phone and you've called them. You know, they may be an hour, 2 or 3 away before they can get to you. So you know, be prepared is all I'm saying. You know, just like if you were going in winter conditions, you know, on your car or truck, you know, pack some extra stuff. It's easy. It doesn't take up much space. And like I said, it could literally save your lives. So think about that as well. And that'll about wrap it up for tonight's show. We hope you enjoyed some of the things we talked about tonight. Please go over to and hit that like button, and also hit that subscribe button. Like I said, folks, we'll be coming to you live every Thursday night at 7 o'clock. So please, you know, send us an email. Tell us how you like the show. If you have an idea for the show and would like us to do a video for you, or a topic or a subject, feel free to drop me a line. Jstfish Outdoors, just like the title says there. You can reach me on Facebook. You can reach me at Jstfish Outdoors at jstfish.com, just like it's spelled there, folks, Jstfish. And we'll try to put something together for you. We have some really neat shows coming up with some of the new electronics, Lowrance electronics, that are getting ready to be released in the not too distant future. We're going to be talking about boats. We're going to be talking about motors. We're going to be talking about all kinds of neat stuff. So hopefully be coming out for too long with our Christmas list ideas for those who are looking to purchase gifts for loved ones that fish, and we'll most certainly help you any way we can. So anyway, we'll do it for tonight's show, and this is Dale York for Jstfish Outdoors saying we'll catch you later.